Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the Arizona Cardinals site from the USA Today and NFL Wire. My co-host is Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, from the SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site, and we are in episode 355. This is actually a bonus episode. We are going to do two shows. Two shows are going to be released this week. You might not notice the difference because if you already subscribe to the show, it just shows up in your podcast episodes, ready to do it. But we're actually recording two shows, and we'll just release them on different days. We have a couple of big things. Obviously, one was the NFL draft. That will not be the topic of this edition of the show, but that will be released on Thursday. So Wednesday, this edition of the show will drop, and Thursday, the draft show will drop. What we're going to focus on this edition of the show is, it's not great, and that would be DeAndre Hopkins. After we all got excited about the trade for Marquise Brown and the slew of weapons that the Cardinals are going to have offensively, then on Monday, the report comes out that DeAndre Hopkins has been suspended for 6 games under the league's performance-enhancing substances. So this is what the show is going to be about on this edition of the show. Let's talk about the suspension and, does this ruin the Cardinals' chances? We'll look at what we view. How do we view Hopkins moving forward? What adjustments should the Cardinals take this offseason? We will talk about the impact of Marquise Brown, since now his trade, it feels like kind of the Odell Beckham situation last year for the Rams. He was a luxury that after Robert Woods got hurt, it became a necessity. Kind of the same situation now. And then Dez Bryant, we'll talk about him. That's how we'll start. But Seth, when the news hit, I'll admit, I missed the news initially. I was in the middle of teaching class, and I saw a graphic from my graphic guy who tagged me on Slack that already had the graphic for the suspension. I'm like, what in the world? And I was like, of course. Arizona sports fans understand this. We don't get nice things, do we?
No, and it's just, it's unfortunate because we came into the offseason knowing that they needed to add a weapon to help the offense. And they go into the draft and get 2 that will definitely help immediately. Obviously, like you said, Marquise Brown and then Trey McBride. And then, you've got some other things that you look at. You've got the addition of, running backs and things like that. And so you're just coming out of Sunday basically like, oh, okay, this is an improved offense. Marquise Brown, DeAndre Hopkins, they'll be in a good spot. And then we get the news, and you're like, well, I guess they won't have an improved offense because you just lost your best player. And that's where it just gets really difficult, man. Like, this team has been trying really hard to build a great offense, and they were on pace for that last year. And then obviously
things broke down. Kyler got hurt. DeAndre got hurt. Chase Edmonds got hurt. The offensive line stopped playing well.
And so this year you're like, okay, you're kind of trying to make it foolproof, right? Like, you're trying to make it where all of these guys work out. And then you just get this body blow, and it's just, and you just, I guess the only good thing is it's happening now where they have all off season to figure it out, right? As opposed to week 3 or 4 or 5, and then they're off to a great start again, and then we're going, oh, here we go again. Instead of an injury this time, though, it's this or that or the other thing. So, it's disappointing, mostly, but there were, at the end of the day, man, I feel like they did enough to weather that storm.
And I agree. I do agree with that. Are the Cardinals toast? They're certainly not toast. They were an 11-win team last year. They the second half of the year, they have J.J. Watt back. This is a team that last year was better than expected, and with just who they brought back, they should be a competitive team. They should be able to compete in the NFC West. Maybe not at the same level as the Rams. Maybe we didn't think that last year, but should they be able to compete for the wild card? Absolutely. It's not ideal, but the loss of that really is for this the best thing to come out of this is the fact that the suspension, we know it now, and they don't have to make adjustments mid-season and kind of fly by the seat of their pants. They can make all the adjustments ahead of time, and that, are there chances? Is it already adversity? Every team that's ever been worth a dang has had to face some sort of adversity, and this is another thing they'll have to overcome. Now, it is, and when you go back to 2019. Patrick Peterson, and you felt like, oh, come on. Just as you're building this new team, you're trying to gear things up, it's just a hit. And Cardinals fans and fans of Arizona sports are so familiar with this, is that just when things look up, something happens. But I guess that probably happens across the board. And so I'm not too worried yet. Obviously, they're not going to be quite at the same level when you lose Hopkins. But let's be honest, you now, instead of having three players who were number one receivers for their teams, you still have two. Now Hopkins is top 3, top 4 receiver in this league. Still, AJ Green was one of the best, and his play declined, obviously, but he was an alpha for years in Cincy. Marquise Brown, and he was their guy when it came to the receiver, and obviously their offense was not receiver friendly per se. It wasn't receiver driven like Cliff Kingsbury's, but you have 2 other receivers on the roster who know how to be that guy, and so that's going to be really helpful. And yeah, we'll talk about what the adjustments make, but I think that's the first thing to note. They're not done, not even close. Is it a big deal? Absolutely, but no way are they absolutely toast. And that's my takeaway of all of this.
Yeah, and I just think, it's overreaction season anyways. I always joke about it. I never grade drafts the way other people do, and I've written about it for years. The way I grade drafts has always been like, you look at everybody's and you say, hey, this is still a draft. Like, we're not going to know anything. And I've always, and Jess doesn't drink, but I drink enough for the both of us. and I've always said, like, it's like beer. Like, everybody has beer they like, if you do drink beer, and they have, really high end beers that they love. They have beers that they just love to drink. And then you have a beer where you say, oh, it's still a beer. Like, I'm going to drink it. Like, I don't have to like it. And that's kind of how I look at the NFL draft. Like, it's the same way. Like, yeah, there are drafts that people go gaga over, right? The Baltimore Ravens this year, people are like, oh my gosh, they killed the draft.
Remember the Cardinals 2019 draft?
Right.
Everyone loved it.
And so like that happens. I get that. But like at the end of the day, there's a lot to it. And you just kind of go with it and figure out, what this team is now. And that's what they're gonna have to figure out, man. Like at the end of the day, they're going to have to figure out what type of team they are and what type of franchise they're building, because that is the question in all of this: is what are they building? Are they going to be a good enough franchise to withstand losing a player of DeAndre Hopkins, status for 6 weeks?
Yeah. Let's talk about some other factor about this. So coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of our Cardinals Talk on the web, let's talk about how this might affect our perception of Hopkins and maybe his legacy in the league. That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of our Cardinals Talk on the web. And the first thing that comes to mind, I know Patrick Peterson, especially here locally, he already had taken a hit in terms of PR with fans when he requested that trade. And then on top of that, before the suspension, he also had this quasi holdout type of thing when he had a skirmish or a tiff with management because of his contract situation. But what does this suspension now do up to our perception of DeAndre Hopkins and to his league-wide legacy as one of the all-time greats? What do you think?
Right now it doesn't really do anything for me. I'm sure eventually down the road we'll look at this and wonder and have some questions. But right now, I just look at it as this guy, so let's look at this first. And Jess and I got a text from our buddy Blake Murphy, who sent a screenshot over from, I believe, a Reddit post or something like that laid out that the guy that was helping with DeAndre's rehab, not even sure his name, but he had 3 or 4 other players.
So Will Fuller, Bradley Roby, and AJ Boye, all of them who were former Texans.
Yeah, and all being clients, patients, however you want to look at it, of this person. And so you look at it from that perspective, right? And you go, well, the worst thing to me that DeAndre did was allow this guy to be in charge of his rehab, right? Like maybe that was his biggest mistake, because he's already caused 3 other players
it's like kind of the Alex Guerrero situation, right? Where these players swear by him, but there's something a little seemingly off. This is one of those situations. I mean, there's a pattern, right? It can't be a coincidence that 4 guys that used the same trainer rehab guy end up getting nipped with the PEDs.
Yeah, and so to me, that's the only thing. Like, I've seen people be like, oh, this taints everything he's done. He's probably been on PEDs his whole career. It's like, well, if he's been on PED his whole career, then he was really good at it, and then he slipped up finally. But I go the other way of he probably took something knowingly or unknowingly. I'm not gonna vouch for him, and
he
be
probably knowingly took a different substance than what he had been taking before. So there was something new to his regimen, likely.
Yeah, that was going to help him recover from the nagging hamstring issue he was dealing with. And so, man, that happens. It, like, again, you can say, hey, he made a bad decision, and I will 100% agree with that statement. What I'm not going to agree with at this juncture is any idea that this taints what he's done in the past, because now we're just assuming, right? Now we're just going, well, I assume that he's been taking steroids his whole career, instead of just being like, hey, This is, this happens. We've seen it with other players before get popped. It's unfortunate. And so now what we need to do moving forward is, if it happens again, then obviously it's it's something that we have to question and worry about. But outside of that, man, like that's all I can think of for me is that like I don't see a guy that's taken PEDs his whole career. Like I just don't.
I don't. Well, and here's the critical thing, and it's the thing that unfortunately for Cardinals fans that we dealt with is that Patrick's play was uneven after he came back from his suspension. The year and a half he was with the team after his suspension, and so which led you to believe, oh, he needed it. We'll have to wait and see with DeAndre in this case. Now, I will say this. When you saw the 6-game suspension, I was like, no way. Because I thought it was the exact same situation as Patrick, where he got napped for a positive test for banned substance and trying to cover it up. And I'll be honest, without double checking the CBA, because I remember I checked the CBA in 2019 when Patrick said, and I went to the NFLPA site and cited exactly on the article that I wrote about Patrick and what that meant, what the 6-game suspension meant, and I tweeted that information, and let me go check it just to be sure. And wouldn't you know it, I had to delete those tweets because I was inaccurate. So this situation is not based on the suspension. It is not the same scenario as Patrick Peterson. With the new CBA that went into place this last year, what it means is that, well, before, either if you tested positive, a player tested positive for a banned stimulant or anabolic agent, they would be suspended for 4 games. In that any attempt, any trace of covering it up, whether it be through a diuretic, a masking agent, or manipulation of the test results, or someone else's pee, for example, if there was evidence of that, they'd tacked on another 2 games. And that was the situation with Patrick. That's how you get 6 games. That's not the case now in 2022. The league's policy for banned substances or performance-enhancing substances is that if you are test positive for a banned stimulant, it is now only 2 games instead of 4. And if you test positive for an anabolic agent, it is 6 games. And then any foul play beyond that would be an additional 2 games, which would make it 8. It would have been 8 games if Hopkins had tried to cover it up. And the cover-up, like when you have that suggests he knew what he was doing or knew that he had taken something that either he knew he was doing it or found out after the fact and tried to cover it up. With just the 6-game suspension, this suggests it was a positive test for an anabolic agent, and this is what Hopkins stated and his brand manager stated. And the way it was worded, people thought, well, why isn't he appealing it? It's really not. Appealing it doesn't necessarily do anything or is fruitful, because once they test positive, they have a B sample and they retest. And so this is the result after the B test. Notice we're getting word of the suspension now in May, after it was for a positive test in November. So that's how the process is not. It's not a fast process. And so by accepting the suspension, he is accepting the fact ultimately at his responsibility to take care of what is put in his body. But at the same time, he could say, I don't know what it was. I don't knowingly do that. As opposed to, and I will say this, I'm not sure why it said that, because one of the original NFL.com stories said that he was suspended, that was a positive test for an anabolic agent and for the diuretics. And I don't know, I wonder if there was a mistake about that, because I did not see that reported by any national reporter, over social media. and it would have been an 8-game suspension. So it's very, very interesting to see that part. And that's the main difference for me. He didn't try to cover it up, so this very well might have been an unfortunate mistake, whether it was intentional or not. He has to take responsibility for it, because you have to be, and it's so hard. Honestly, it's so hard for players to it's not an easy thing, and even a bad batch of something could come back and bite you in the rear. And so I hope that's the case. But ultimately, it's what's going to come down to is, does his play continue to be at that high level? Or is this something that we see lingering injuries? This is an odd point in his career. So this is a note, a footnote, a mental footnote moving forward. What do we think of Hopkins' career after this? If there's nothing ever again, and he continues to play at that Hall of Fame level, then this is a blip to me.
Yeah, and I think that's the way we have to look at it, right? Like, that's the only way to look at it until he gets back out there and we can see what he is. But right now, that's the only way we can really look at it, and then we adjust from there. And until we see him on the field and can judge for ourselves, I don't think there's anything else to really question or worry about in terms of his legacy.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, we'll talk about the adjustments that the Cardinals can and need to make in the absence of Hopkins as they first start the 6 games of the season without him. That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. DeAndre Hopkins is out for 6 games, and we saw what happened last year when he got hurt, and then the offense just didn't click, and it wasn't just his absence. Now you can point to that as that was a major reason why, because the way they built that receiver room by adding AJ Green that allows Christian Kirk to slide into the slot is that by putting DeAndre Hopkins at that X position where it's going to draw the most attention, he gets the one-on-ones, that defenses were going to have to pay attention to him, which would lead to opportunities for Green and opportunities for Kirk. When he went down, and they could have gone 2 different ways. You could either shift everyone in their role, like you'll sometimes see that on an offensive line or in a secondary, where, all right, so if DeAndre's out, well, AJ can play X, you slide him over there. Kirk can play the Z, he can play outside, and then you bring in Rondale Moore. They chose not to do that because, in theory, what does that do? You end up downgrading 3 positions, right? And so instead, they just slid Antoine Wesley into that X position, where that's where he had taken all those reps. AJ Green had not taken X reps, I don't think, all year. He was at the Z in a new offense. And for many reasons, it made sense. Green had not played that position. It was his first year in the offense. And as a result, you would hope that Green and Kirk would step up, because that Wesley is not going to draw the attention. That at least one of 2 things happens. That Green/Kirk play at a high enough level to where they have to draw attention away, which would then allow Wesley to perform at a higher level, to be productive. He had to be great, but productive. And he did produce a few catches, but it's not like he didn't have much. He had he had 3 touchdowns over the last few games, but it didn't work out because Kirk and Green did not elevate their play, and their play did not draw the coverage away, which led to, say, Rondale or Zach Ertz or James Conner or Antoine Wesley getting big production. That just didn't happen, and so it was kind of a snowball effect. And then on top of that, you had the defense, which got worse because of injuries to Watt. You had the stretch where Chandler Jones wasn't getting the pass rush. Then you lose Watt, you lose Robert Alford, you lose Marco Wilson. And so the pass defense really struggles. And then the offensive line struggles. And then you have Chase Edmonds and James Conner, who are not on the field. They are not healthy at the same game for like the whole second half of the season. And then everything went to the poop. So we can do one of two things this offseason. And which do you think they should do? You can shift people around. And now if you've got Marquise Brown, you've got Rondale Moore, and you've got A.J. Green. But now that's the offseason. You've got months to prepare for this. Slide A.J. to the X, where he played most of his career. You've got Marquise, who can now play the Z. You've got Rondale, who can play in the slot. And Rondale was going to kind of be the odd man out, it's kind of felt like. So he was going to have the manufactured touches with the addition of Brown. Or you can keep AJ at the Z. You have Marquise playing the Christian Kirk role, playing some of the slots, some outside. You have Rondale playing his gadget guy, the fourth wide receiver role, and subbing in for, 2 or 3 of the positions. And then you slide in, either bring in another receiver to play the X, or you have Antoine Wesley playing there again. If you're Cliff Kingsbury, what do you think Cliff should do?
It'd be interesting. I think in this offense, in year 2, I think that you slide. I think you slide Green over into that X role because he knows the offense a little bit better, right?
Yeah,
and then
totally.
and then from there, that's where you have to kind of make your decisions, right? You look at it and you say, like, this guy has to play better, so Rondell's got to step up and kind of and become a better player, and then Marquis has to learn the offense. So I think all of that kind of flows together in then going, we want to just give Marquis kind of one job like right now, and then Rondell keep working on the one job he knows, and that's kind of how you build it. That's how I would initially approach it, especially because you have the whole offseason. I think that's something that you and I have obviously talked about, but I think needs to be talked about more, is that having the whole offseason to prepare for this makes this so much easier than the way it went last season. And so you really can prep as best as possible for what is a nearly impossible situation, right? Like, you're asking to replace the production of one of the best players in the NFL. And so I think this year, with the addition of Brown, the drafting of McBride, that allows them to do more things. I don't think we realize how big of a injury the Max Williams injury was until DeAndre got hurt, right? Because Max got hurt in the
Week
second
5.
Or was it that early?
Yeah, he was the 5th game of the year.
That's right. It was the first San Francisco game. Yeah, so Max got hurt early, and we didn't really notice it because the offense was still humming so well. But all of a sudden, then Max goes out. The passing game is still working, so opening up the running game. And then the running game goes out, and all of a sudden Max goes out and DeAndre's out. So now the passing game is not as good as now, and now the running game is not up to snuff. And so I think adding McBride, and I'm not going to say he's going to be at the level of Max Williams as a run blocker, but I think he can get close to that in year 1. And I think all of that's going to play into what this team can be, competitively speaking. And like you said, I think the fact that they have options is really important, because last year, like you said, they just went, all right, Antoine Wesley, you're replacing DeAndre Hopkins. Let's hold our breath. And obviously we kind of saw how that worked out.
Right. And he showed a little promise, but he did, for that to work, he had to have much more production than he did.
Well,
not because of him, but because you needed Kirk and Green to be better in their roles.
Let's just be honest, too. The fact that they got as much as they did from him was kind of staggering. Like, this is a dude that's never been on a roster before, never had any semblance of production before, And now you're getting high level. You're asking him to replace a 1,400-yard receiver, like, and so the fact that they got what they did out of him, that just tells me that he's a guy you can have on your roster that can be that fifth receiver and be a viable fifth receiver. Yeah, he's never going to be
if he was going to be. We always said if Wesley, you're counting on him to be wide receiver 4, cool.
Right, exactly.
And this year they were going to count on to be a wide receiver 5. So,
right, exactly. So it'll be interesting to kind of see how this goes. But I do like the options they have this year.
And for me, I think adjustment number 1 is, and this is for 2 things. So this is basing on 2 different things that Cliff Kingsbury has said. One would be he laments some of the adjustments he didn't make. He didn't adjust more. And we've talked about this to some extent, is that I think that Cliff, in part, trusted Kyler too much. I will tell you this. Cliff Kingsbury is Kyler Murray's biggest fan and believes he is a star. And so he trusted Kyler to be the guy to elevate the play of the others, probably unfairly so. And so rather than moving other guys around and having them play different roles to kind of help Kyler, it was, this is the easiest thing to do. Let's put Wesley out there and just kind of do what we've been doing. And we saw how that kind of failed a few times because we saw a couple of red zone plays where, that is a Hopkins play, but you threw it to Wesley and it failed on 4th down because it wasn't DeAndre Hopkins. And so he laments not making more adjustments. Okay, 1. 2, he also lamented not utilizing A.J. Green more. So this tells me that probably move number 1 is A.J. Green to the X. Also, interesting perspective on the Big Red Rage when Drew Grigson, their director of player personnel, was on. He talked a little bit about the return of A.J. Green. And because Steve Keim last year when they signed Green, referred to him as a Z, perfect Z for them at this point of his career. Grigson referred to him as an X. So I think the adjustment number 1, if there's one thing they do, they're going to move AJ over so that this offseason he can get reps at that position so that you can then wait and see on the other positions. That way they involve AJ more because he was having it was a puzzlingly nice and frustrating season. But if Cliff, if that first year in the offense, he was able to produce like he did up until the end of the season, that's a guy you can probably rely on to perform at not at all pro level, but a productive level there at the X. And then you kind of wait and see how things play out in the other roles, right?
Yeah, and that's what this is all about in the end, is you're really looking at finding the roles for each of these guys. And if he can do his job and they can, all compete and put up the numbers that they need to put up. And I think we will see it. I really do. I think we'll be able to see it. It's just going to be, you're going to have to give it some time because you're asking different guys to do different things now that they've not done before. And so that's, to me, going to be the biggest thing that we look for heading into this.
Coming next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best ever Cardinals talk on the web. Let's talk specifically about the addition of Hollywood Brown. What does that mean for this offense moving forward? That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise of See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Marquise Brown. So we will talk a little bit about Marquise Brown in our draft edition that we're doing our next episode. But this is more breaking it down. We'll talk about that in terms of value in using the pick. Should they have used a first round pick? That's what we're not debating. We're just debating what impact he has. And here's what I like. You like that what Cliff Kingsbury said is that they view him as their Christian Kirk replacement. Now, last year Kirk played basically exclusively in the slot, but in 2020 2020 and 2019, he played a hybrid role. So he played outside and inside, a little of both. So he played outside in 2 wide sets. He played inside on 4 wide sets, especially in 2020. And so he played both roles. And when they got Marquise Brown, what they really like about him is that he's not a one-position receiver. He can play outside. He can play inside. He can do things underneath. He can do things and take the top off the field because he is fast. That sort of impact guy. If you had to think back to the type of player he's like, he is, I'd say, a better version of John Brown. A more polished version, would you say?
Yeah, he's a cleaner version of John Brown.
And we know what kind of impact he had on the offense. So I think, and when you had Hopkins and you had AJ Green and you had Marquise Brown, that was going to be a lights out offense, because then you have the overall just awesomeness of Hopkins, and you've got the length of Green, and then the shiftiness and speed of Brown in the slot. And mind you, Marquise Brown was their number one receiver in Baltimore. He was their top receiver. Now, you could argue they had a run-heavy offense, and probably that their number one receiving option was a tight end. But when it came to receiver routes, he was the man. He was the guy. He was their number one receiver last year. So in a run-heavy offense where Lamar Jackson was hurt for several games of last season, he had 91 catches for over 1,000 yards and 6, I think, touchdowns. And they view him as a Christian Kirk replacement. I love, this is the way I view it. They got a replacement for Christian Kirk who's better and cheaper. And I think his versatility is going to be critical. And because he played in an offense like this in college, I think there's going to be automatic rapport with Kyler Murray. And so I think he has the opportunity to be great this year. And to really, even if AJ's playing the X, I think Hollywood is going to be a force to be reckoned with, especially early in the season before Hopkins comes back.
Yeah, and I think he's going to be, like you said, it's going to be enjoyable to watch him kind of grow into the position and learn exactly his role in the offense and what he's going to be able to do. The other thing is this. The addition of Hollywood was to take, like you said, some of the pressure off of Hopkins when he gets back. Obviously, the team already knew about this.
That's important to note, everyone, is that this trade was in part motivated by that, because it was about a week leading up to about a week before the draft when things started getting big, and that was a deal that was going to happen anyway. Steve Keim said the team knew about this suspension. Yes, they did. That when the public hears about suspensions, it's not rocking the world of the teams. They're trying to deal with things behind the scenes before it's announced. So yes, this was in part highly motivated by the suspension.
And so when they make that move, all of a sudden, right, you've got a guy in mind, and then you look at it, right, and you look at D-Hop has had a lot of success in his career already. So like that wasn't an issue. But if you go back to his days with the Texans, when did he have his most success? And that was when he had a guy like Will Fuller across from him. It could really stretch the defense and put pressure on the safeties to have to remain deep. Now all of a sudden he's got a similar, if not slightly better version of that in Marquise Brown. And now you're just going to plop DeAndre Hopkins right back into this offense that he already knows. I mean,
And he'll be joining the offense once Hollywood is more comfortable in it.
Right. And so that's the thing is, I mean, you're just adding success to it. And so for me, that's the way I look at it. I look at this as this is a good thing, and it's going to really help the Cardinals in the long run, that they'll be able to kind of, grow from this and be a better team from this. Maybe that's an optimistic outlook, but realistically, I think it's going to force them to put some pressure on Brown early to, get him acclimated quickly. And then what it's going to do is it's going to allow Hop to come in and then all of a sudden just be D, right? Like he's not going to have to do anything more. And you're going to have a guy in Brown that's already comfortable in the offense. Like it realistically should complete this offense. And we haven't even really gotten into Trey McBride because we're going to talk about that on the next episode.
Absolutely. Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the Best Hour of Cardinals Talk on the Web. Let's talk about an X Factor, Dez Bryant. That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, Best Hour of Cardinals Talk on the Web, and right out of the blue, before the suspension of DeAndre Hopkins, TMZ Sports tracks down Dez Bryant, former Dallas Cowboy stud. Last played in 2020 for a few games with the Baltimore Ravens, but hasn't played a full season since 2017. Suddenly wants to play for the Cardinals. He was on TMZ Sports. They caught him. He was on Sirius XM on a show, I Am Athlete, with Brandon Marshall and Antoine Walker, and they brought it up again. He talked about wanting to join the Cardinals, which is, okay, that team specifically. He's close to DeAndre Hopkins. He loves the swagger of Kyler Murray. He loves the offense of Cliff Kingsbury. And it's interesting because he's not angling to come in and be Dez. The guy who was the guy for the Cowboys for however many years. Instead, he wants to be part of the locker room and part of the influence in that locker room. I think he misses the locker, but at the same time, it's very interesting because he doesn't talk like he thinks he can make a big impact on the field. It's like, I'm not going to be Dez Bryant. I'm like, well, what are you? So you're just trying to get an NFL paycheck again? but it leads to an interesting question. One, what could Dez Bryant offer the Cardinals? One, and two, could you put him at the X to fill in for Hopkins for the first 6 weeks and allow Green and Markey and Green and Hollywood to do their thing on the other part of the field? Could you use Dez in that role for that part of the season, or would that be foolish? Yeah. What do you think?
I mean, I think they have enough right now to just kind of move forward as is. I get it's never bad to have another option in there, especially at receiver, as we saw last year, right? That was just kind of a huge issue. And so I think for that reason, you look at it and you see a guy that you can bring in that's a veteran that knows how to play the game, and can kind of give you some stuff. At the same time, I don't know if you need that, if that makes sense.
Right. The back end of your receiver room, you got to have someone who can play special. It's just a fact. Now, honestly, now's the time of year is where he can throw. And I think he's putting his name out there right now in part because he understands at this point of his career, He's not going to be... The first thing I thought when I'm like, Dez Bryant, it's totally Michael Crabtree again. There was a big difference with Michael Crabtree. They signed him at the very end of the preseason, didn't play him in the preseason. He never practiced with them in training camp. And then he was on the week 1 roster, was no good. And they ended up having to eat that entire salary because he was a veteran who was on the week 1 roster. This would be different because you'd bring in Dez for the entire offseason, and if he's no good, guess what? You can just cut him.
Yeah, you just move on.
And you just move on. Kind of like, crap. What was the name of the guy? The first round pick. I totally drawn a blank. The speedy number 4 pick who busted out of... Oh, man.
I'll figure it out shortly. But yeah, I mean, that's what you do, right? You just bring in guys. Oh, Kevin White.
Yes. Frick. Yes. Kevin White.
And you just kind of bring in guys and you like you said, you kind of throw it at the wall. I'm like, let's see what sticks here.
If he's going to be in OTAs, there's nothing wrong with that. So this would be the time to do it. Like when they brought in Kevin White, only just don't give him any guaranteed money. Don't give him any guaranteed money. Say, come on in. You want to play for the Cardinals? Yeah. Come on in. We'll see what you got.
Yeah. And so it'll be interesting to see, because I think that's like you said, if he's willing to come in and so to speak, eat the crap and be a guy that works out and tries out and does all that stuff, then yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. But if he's a guy that doesn't want to put in the time, then there's no reason to. But if he's willing to come out, like I said, and put time in and work and see if he still has anything left, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think he has anything left, if that is fair enough.
Well, but wouldn't he have? I know he was hurt. He had one injury. Like he signed with the Saints, and before he even got on the field, he got hurt. But he hasn't played meaningful football since 2017. Now we could say the same thing about AJ Green up until last year, but he had been playing games and just wasn't putting up meaningful numbers, and he came back and showed that he could play at a fairly high level.
Right, and that's kind of what you look at for him, and what if he can do all of that and still be a guy that can compete.
Yeah, but in the end, I
don't think it's going to happen.
No, probably not. And I think what we're hearing from Dez, it's not necessarily like a hint of what's to come. I think it's Dez putting his name out there. Like, he misses football. Maybe not necessarily the workout part. He misses the locker room, which is the one thing that former players struggle with. That's the part that they struggle the most with, is because there are very, very few jobs where you get that same sort of camaraderie that you do in the locker room. There's nothing like it in the real world. It's just not. It's interesting. But yeah. And with that, this is the end of our DeAndre Hopkins episode 355. We will have another episode dropping very soon with the NFL draft. So we will be back in a couple of days, even though we were actually recording this episode immediately after. We're just going to release them on different days. So with that, that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Rude. This is the Rise Up See Red podcast. We'll be back in a couple of days. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms, so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, Rise Up, See Red.